the dawn of the 1940s, the world watched in disbelief as Adolf Hitler's armies marched across Europe like an unstoppable storm. France had fallen in weeks. Britain was cornered, its cities burning under nightly air raids. And across the Atlantic, America, still nursing the wounds of the Great Depression, watched in uneasy silence. For a time, it looked as if nothing could stop Nazi Germany. Their blitzkrieg, lightning war, shattered defenses before opponents could even react. German tanks rolled with precision, their soldiers drilled with fanatical discipline, and their propaganda machine portrayed them as the architects of a new world order. To many, Hitler appeared invincible. His speeches echoed across continents. His army stood unchallenged from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow. But beneath the surface of his victories, a fatal illusion was already forming, an illusion of total control. Because while Germany conquered land, it failed to conquer resources. Its victories were fueled by stolen fuel, looted food, and overworked factories. Every tank rolling east meant another shortage of steel. Every plane in the sky meant more fuel that Germany could not replace. And across the ocean, the sleeping giant began to stir. In quiet factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, lights burned through the night. Engineers and factory workers began retooling. Assembly lines once making cars now forged tanks. Radios became communication devices for the front. While Hitler bragged about power, America built it, silently, systematically, relentlessly. President Roosevelt understood something Hitler never did. That wars aren't just won by armies, they're won by machines, resources, and willpower. While the Wehrmacht consumed everything it touched, the United States began creating an endless river of steel, fuel, and firepower. The arsenal of democracy was being born. Hitler dismissed America as soft, a land of businessmen, he said. He could not comprehend how a capitalist democracy could mobilize millions of free men faster than his totalitarian regime. But that was his greatest mistake. By 1941, while Hitler invaded Russia, believing the war was already his, America had begun converting its economy into a war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Each factory became a fortress. Each worker became a soldier in overalls. Each new shipment of supplies to Britain was a quiet strike against the Reich. And then came the turning point, Pearl Harbor. Hitler had hoped Japan's attack would distract America. Instead, it awakened it. Overnight, the United States declared war not only on Japan, but on Germany itself. And from that moment, the tide began to turn. The illusion of invincibility began to crumble. Because Hitler didn't just go to war with nations. He went to war with an idea, the idea that freedom, industry, and collective determination could outmatch tyranny. From that point forward, the war was no longer about who held more territory, it was about who could endure longer, produce more, and outthink the other. Germany had tanks. America had time, factories, and will. And those would soon prove to be the deadliest weapons of all. The storm was coming, not from the skies, but from the foundries, the shipyards, and the minds of millions who refused to bow. When America entered the Second World War, it wasn't ready for the battlefield, but it was ready for something far greater, production on a scale the world had never seen. In 1941, America had fewer than 200,000 active soldiers, minimal tanks, and almost no modern warplanes. Hitler laughed at this. He called America a nation of mechanics, not warriors. But that would soon become his greatest nightmare, because in the age of total war, mechanics were far deadlier than soldiers. Factories that once built cars and refrigerators were transformed into military strongholds overnight. The hum of civilian life turned into the thunder of industry. Steel mills glowed through the night, assembly lines never stopped moving, and workers, men and women alike, worked around the clock under one collective mission, to arm the free world. The numbers were staggering. In 4 years, American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. No empire in history had ever seen such output. This was not just industry. This was organized chaos turned into precision. The transformation began with a single phrase from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." Those words weren't political, they were a battle cry. Detroit, once the heart of car manufacturing, became the beating engine of war. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant alone produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. At the peak of its power, American industry could build in a single day what Germany could not in a month. And the beauty of it, it wasn't driven by fear, but by freedom. American workers weren't forced into labor, they volunteered. Housewives became riveters. Teenagers joined assembly lines. Engineers designed faster, cheaper, deadlier machines. Every new innovation widened the gap between the Allies and the Reich. Hitler's scientists worked in secret laboratories. America's innovation came from open collaboration, the minds of thousands unified by purpose. And as American factories roared, their ships carried waves of steel across the Atlantic. Convoys of Liberty ships, hastily built cargo vessels, began crossing oceans faster than German U-boats could sink them. Each one carried food, fuel, tanks, and planes to Allied fronts. Every Liberty ship that reached Britain was another nail in Hitler's coffin. Germany had no answer. Its own factories were being bombed by the very aircraft the US had built in its thousands. Fuel shortages strangled its tanks. Its war machine began to choke under its own arrogance. And yet, the most devastating part wasn't the weaponry, it was the realization. Hitler finally understood that he hadn't gone to war against one nation, he had gone to war against a system that could endlessly regenerate. He could conquer land, but not capacity. He could destroy cities, but not will. By 1943, while German generals begged for resources, America was launching Operation Overlord, constructing bomber fleets, and arming Russia and Britain simultaneously. The American war machine didn't just supply itself, it fed entire nations. It was a weapon not made of steel, but of unity, innovation, and sheer scale. Every bullet, every tank, every soldier who landed in Normandy carried not only American might, but the output of millions of ordinary people who believed tyranny could be beaten with creation. As the Reich bled itself dry, the United States grew stronger with each passing month. Factories became temples of resistance. Production lines were battlefields. And from this industrial storm, a new kind of warfare was born, one where efficiency was deadlier than any bomb. By the time Hitler realized it, it was already too late. He had unleashed his armies upon the world, but he had awakened something greater. An industrial civilization with the power to outlast empires. And soon, that civilization would bring the fight to his doorstep. War is fought with bullets and bombs, but it is won with information. And while the world watched the roar of tanks and the thunder of planes, another battle was taking place, silent, invisible, and far more decisive. This was the War of Minds, a secret struggle fought in hidden rooms, coded messages, and sleepless nights. It was here that America's next great weapon revealed itself, intelligence. When the US entered World War II, the field of intelligence was still young. There was no CIA, no satellites, no global surveillance. Yet within a few short years, American codebreakers and spies would dismantle Hitler's illusion of secrecy. At the heart of this silent revolution was a collaboration unlike anything the world had seen, the partnership between British cryptographers at Bletchley Park and American intelligence at Arlington Hall. Together, they formed the Allied brain, quietly listening to every whisper from Berlin. The target was the Enigma machine, a cryptographic device the Nazis believed unbreakable. It encoded German communications through an ever-changing series of mechanical rotors, creating billions of possible combinations. The Germans were so confident in its power that they used it to coordinate every movement, from troop deployments to U-boat attacks. But the Allies were listening. With early breakthroughs from Polish mathematicians and relentless work from Alan Turing's team in Britain, the Allies managed to breach Enigma. Once the Americans joined the effort, the operation expanded beyond imagination. The result was Ultra, the codename for one of the most secret and successful intelligence operations in history. Through Ultra, the Allies could read Hitler's orders often before his generals could. They knew where the Luftwaffe would strike, where submarines prowled, and when convoys were in danger. What appeared to Germany as luck, a ship dodging a torpedo, an ambush avoided, a bombing raid intercepted, was actually precision guided by information. But it wasn't just code breaking. America developed networks of double agents, analysts, and field spies who fed false information into the Nazi machine. Entire operations, like Operation Fortitude, which misled Hitler about the D-Day landing, were built on deception. The American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, coordinated psychological warfare, sabotage, and intelligence across occupied Europe. They armed resistance groups, disrupted supply lines, and spread propaganda deep within Hitler's empire. To the Nazis, chaos began to appear everywhere. Fuel depots exploded, communication lines vanished, orders were lost, and morale began to rot. But behind that chaos was design. While Hitler trusted brute force, the Americans trusted knowledge. While Germany obsessed over control, America mastered influence. The German command structure, rigid and paranoid, could not adapt to invisible warfare. Every failure was blamed on betrayal. Every delay deepened Hitler's distrust. He began to suspect his own officers. Paranoia turned the Reich inward, weakening it from within. Meanwhile, American intelligence grew stronger. The more Germany spoke, the more it revealed. By 1944, the Allies were no longer reacting to Germany's moves, they were predicting them. In truth, Hitler was no longer fighting an army. He was fighting an omniscient enemy, one that saw his plans before they unfolded. The war had entered a new dimension, one fought not only in blood, but in silence. And while the world credited tanks and planes for the Allied advance, it was the hidden network of codebreakers, spies, and analysts that truly turned the tide. Because power, as history would prove, doesn't just come from strength. It comes from awareness. And America, through intellect and innovation, had made knowledge its ultimate weapon. Before victory could be dreamed of in Europe, America had to win a far deadlier war, not on land, but in the cold, merciless waters of the Atlantic Ocean. It was here, between the continents, that the fate of the world truly hung in the balance. Because if Germany could choke the Atlantic, the Allies would starve. Britain would fall. Russia would be isolated. And Hitler's empire would rule unopposed. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, a war not for cities or armies, but for survival itself. In the early years of the war, the ocean belonged to Germany. Wolf packs of U-boats, sleek, silent submarines, stalked Allied shipping routes. They attacked convoys in darkness, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. Each night, the horizon burned with the glow of oil tankers and transport ships going under. For every ton of supplies America tried to send, Germany sank too. It was a massacre of steel and salt. By 1942, the Atlantic was a graveyard. The U-boats seemed unstoppable. Hitler called them his sea wolves. They operated in coordinated packs, communicating via encrypted radio messages. Every torpedo that struck a convoy was a message that the Reich ruled the seas. But America would answer with its next great secret weapon, innovation and logistics. First came the Liberty ships, simple, mass-produced cargo vessels that could be built in weeks instead of months. Each one carried tanks, fuel, food, and ammunition across the ocean. German submarines couldn't sink them fast enough. For every ship destroyed, 2 more left American ports. Factories in the U.S. East Coast worked 24 hours a day, hammering out new hulls, new engines, new lifelines. America's industrial flood began to overwhelm Germany's naval power. Then came the technological revolution. American engineers developed advanced sonar systems, depth charges, and long-range aircraft capable of patrolling vast stretches of ocean. New radar systems could detect periscopes at a distance, new encryption broke the very codes the U-boats relied upon. Every day, the hunter became the hunted. And then, the skies joined the fight. Long-range bombers and escort planes began to fly with convoys, turning the Atlantic into a battlefield both above and below the waves. U-boats were now visible, vulnerable, and constantly pursued. The U-boat captains, once proud and untouchable, began to die faster than they could be trained. By 1943, more than 70% of German submariners were dead. It was no longer a war, it was a slaughter. The tide of the Atlantic had turned. Behind every victory at sea was an invisible army of workers and thinkers, engineers designing faster ships, scientists perfecting sonar, women in factories welding steel hulls together, and mathematicians decoding enemy signals. This wasn't just warfare, it was a triumph of organization, intellect, and endurance. For Germany, each loss meant fewer resources, fewer supplies, and fewer options. For America, each victory meant the survival of the Allied cause. Convoys reached Britain in record numbers. Supplies poured into Europe and Russia. The Atlantic, once Hitler's weapon, became the artery of freedom. Hitler's admirals warned him that the war was slipping away. But Hitler, blinded by arrogance, refused to believe that America's factories and codebreakers could defeat his submarines. He was wrong. Because by the time he realized it, the Atlantic was already lost. And with it, his dream of starving the Allies into submission. The sea, once painted red by Allied blood, now ran with the wreckage of the Reich's last hope. The lifeline to Europe had been secured. And through that lifeline, the storm of liberation was about to come ashore. The dawn of June 6, 1944, was not quiet. It was the sound of destiny unfolding, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. More than 150,000 Allied troops, thousands of ships, and an armada of aircraft gathered across the English Channel. The code name was Operation Overlord, but to history, it would be remembered simply as D-Day. For years, Hitler had called his Atlantic defenses Fortress Europe. He believed his concrete walls, barbed wire, and artillery would make any invasion impossible. But he underestimated what America had become, not just a nation, but a machine of liberation. In the early hours before dawn, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines in Normandy. The night sky flickered with tracer fire as they descended into chaos, scattered, disoriented, yet unstoppable. Their mission, to cut off German reinforcements before the main invasion began. Then, as the horizon turned gray, the sea itself seemed to move. Over 5,000 ships advanced toward France, carrying American, British, and Canadian soldiers to the shores of occupied Europe. The Americans had been given two of the toughest beaches, Utah and Omaha. At Utah Beach, the landings went smoother than expected. The troops pushed inland, meeting fierce resistance but securing their objectives. But at Omaha, the gates of hell opened. German machine guns raked the beaches. Artillery turned the sand into craters. Bodies fell into the surf before they could reach cover. The water turned red with blood. The first waves of soldiers were cut down within minutes. Chaos reigned. Communications failed, and the sea wall seemed impossible to cross. Yet amidst that horror, American soldiers refused to break. Small groups began to move, crawling through sand, scaling cliffs, and flanking German positions. They fought inch by inch, yard by yard, until the tide of men finally overran the German bunkers. By midday, the impossible had happened. The Americans had secured Omaha Beach. That single victory opened the road to Europe. Behind this moment was not just courage, it was years of preparation, deception, and sacrifice. American intelligence, as part of Operation Fortitude, had tricked Hitler into believing the invasion would happen at Pas-de-Calais, hundreds of miles away. The Führer moved his best divisions north, leaving Normandy vulnerable. The secret weapon wasn't just technology, it was strategy. As the beaches fell to the Allies, Hitler hesitated. He refused to release his panzer divisions, believing the real invasion was yet to come. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. America's military machine had done what Hitler believed impossible, breached his fortress. By nightfall, over 130,000 Allied troops stood on French soil. The first cracks in the Nazi Empire had opened wide. Every man who landed that day carried not just a rifle, but the weight of civilization itself. They fought not for conquest, but for deliverance. And their victory proved a truth Hitler could never accept, that free men, united by purpose, could achieve what fear never could. The invasion of Normandy was the beginning of the end. Within weeks, Allied forces liberated towns that had lived under the Nazi boot for 4 long years. Within months, they would be marching toward Paris. And within a year, the nightmare of Nazi Germany would collapse under its own delusion. But that story, the collapse of the Reich, would not come easily. Because as America pushed forward, Hitler's madness grew. He still believed he could reverse fate, unleash new weapons, and turn back the tide. He was wrong. The tide was already rising, and it would drown his empire in the flood of freedom that came from the West. By 1944, Hitler still ruled from his bunkers and boasted of an invincible Reich. But above his empire, in the skies once dominated by the Luftwaffe, a new power had risen, a storm of American steel and fire that would break Germany from the heavens. This was not just bombing, it was systematic destruction, engineered by mathematics, precision, and the relentless will of an industrial giant that refused to yield. The war in the air began as a desperate gamble. In 1942, American bombers flew deep into Europe in daylight raids, believing in the accuracy of high-altitude targeting. It was a bold plan, and nearly suicidal. German anti-aircraft fire and fighter squadrons tore through early U.S. bombing runs. Losses were staggering, some crews never returned. The skies over Europe were filled with smoke, flames, and falling metal. But what the Germans didn't understand was that for every bomber lost, America could build 3 more. For every pilot killed, 10 more trained to take his place. Factories back home worked ceaselessly. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator became symbols of unstoppable endurance, aircraft that could take heavy damage, still drop their payloads, and limp home. And soon, they would be joined by the weapon that changed everything, the P-51 Mustang. A fighter fast enough, and with range long enough, to escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The skies that had once belonged to Germany now belonged to America. What followed was a campaign unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Day after day, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched raids deep into the heart of Nazi industry, targeting ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, ammunition depots, and rail lines. This wasn't random destruction. It was strategic annihilation. The goal was not just to destroy buildings, but to paralyze Germany's ability to fight. Each bomb dropped over Hamburg, Berlin, and Essen wasn't aimed at civilians, it was aimed at the machine of war itself. Without oil, tanks couldn't move. Without factories, planes couldn't fly. Without steel, weapons couldn't be made. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had ruled the skies over Poland and France, now faced extinction. German factories were burning faster than they could rebuild. Fuel shortages grounded their best aircraft. Hitler's pilots were now boys, barely trained, barely alive. By late 1944, the sky above Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. Every train that moved, every truck that rolled, every bridge that stood, was a target. And the more the Americans bombed, the weaker the Reich became. Civilians huddled in basements while the night sky turned to flame. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Cities that once symbolized German pride became wastelands of rubble and smoke. And while Hitler raged, America only grew stronger. Every mission refined tactics. Every loss improved design. The bomber crews, once green, became masters of the air. Disciplined, fearless, and united by purpose. The war in the sky was no longer about dominance, it was about inevitability. The Reich was being hollowed from above, its power melting under an avalanche of bombs forged thousands of miles away by ordinary Americans in factories they would never leave. That was the true power of the U.S. industrial weapon. The pilots who dropped the bombs were only the tip of a vast spear, a weapon crafted by millions of invisible hands. By 1945, Hitler's empire could no longer move, no longer produce, no longer breathe. Every tank stood idle. Every plane rusted on the runway. And the Führer, once so obsessed with domination, was left staring at maps that no longer mattered. The thunder from the sky had done its work. The invincible Reich was crumbling, not from invasion yet, but from attrition, starvation, and exhaustion. The air war had not only broken Germany's industry, it had shattered its spirit. The hammer of freedom had fallen from above. While American planes rained fire over Europe and Allied soldiers pushed through France, another front was burning, the Eastern Front, where Hitler's armies faced the fury of the Soviet Union. It was the bloodiest theater in human history. Entire cities were erased. Millions died in frozen trenches, in burnt villages, and in battles that lasted for months. The war in the East consumed Germany's strength, its men, its machines, and its will. But there's one truth history often forgets. The Soviet victory was built, in part, by American steel. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, he believed he was unstoppable. The Blitzkrieg sliced through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The Red Army collapsed under the shock. But as the winter froze German tanks and stretched their supply lines, the truth emerged, the Wehrmacht was running out of everything. Fuel. Trucks. Tires. Radios. Food. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America had already foreseen this moment. Through the Lend-Lease program, President Roosevelt unleashed a torrent of support to the Soviet Union, not just weapons, but the tools of survival. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. sent the Soviets over 400,000 trucks, 14,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks, and 8,000 anti-aircraft guns. Entire railways were rebuilt with American steel. Factories in Siberia were powered with American machinery. Even the Red Army's uniforms, boots, and rations often bore the mark of U.S. production. The Soviet soldiers might have carried Mosin-Nagants, but they rode to war in Studebaker trucks, painted with the words, "Made in USA." And through the frozen Arctic convoys, the most dangerous sea routes in the world, American and British ships delivered endless cargo under fire from U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. Thousands died to keep those routes open. But the cargo reached its destination, and with it, the hope of resistance. Every shell that hit a German tank at Kursk, every Soviet counteroffensive that rolled westward, was backed by a supply line that stretched all the way to America's factories. Hitler had underestimated what that meant. He thought the United States would remain isolated. He thought democracy made nations weak. Instead, he found himself facing a coalition so vast, so coordinated, that it could fight across 3 continents simultaneously. The Wehrmacht's might was now split, the Eastern Front consuming its army, the Western Front draining its air force, and the Atlantic suffocating its supply. By 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad had already turned the tide. German troops were starving, freezing, and surrendering by the tens of thousands. Hitler's obsession with conquest had trapped him. His empire was stretched beyond saving, and America's resources were the silent force tightening the noose. The world saw Soviet soldiers raising their flag after victory, but behind that moment stood the unseen architecture of Allied logistics. It was an alliance of opposites, communist soldiers driving capitalist trucks, fighting fascist armies with democratic steel. And it worked. Because while Germany's ideology divided the world, America's production united it. That was the true genius of the U.S. war effort. It didn't just build for itself, it built for everyone who stood against tyranny. By late 1944, the Red Army was rolling westward like an unstoppable tide. German defenses collapsed one after another. Cities that once marked Hitler's victories, Minsk, Kiev, Warsaw, now became markers of his retreat. The nightmare that began with Blitzkrieg was ending in reverse. And deep down, even the German generals knew the truth. They hadn't just lost to the Russians. They had lost to America's industrial power, the hidden hand that fed, fueled, and armed the enemies of the Reich. Hitler had built a war on ideology. America had built a war on infrastructure. And in the end, infrastructure always wins. By early 1945, the once terrifying Third Reich was little more than a dying animal thrashing in its final cage. Its armies were in retreat on every front. Its cities lay in ruins. Its skies belonged to the enemy. And from the west came the thunder of American armor, unstoppable, disciplined, and inevitable. Hitler had dreamed of a 1,000-year empire. It had lasted barely 12. After D-Day, the Allied advance across France was swift and merciless. The American war machine, fueled by limitless supply lines, moved like a living organism. Each unit fed another. Each victory produced momentum. By the summer of 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, weeping as American soldiers marched through the city that had once been crushed under Nazi boots. It wasn't just liberation, it was resurrection. From there, the push toward Germany began. General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded an army unlike any in history. Millions of men from across the free world, backed by tanks, aircraft, and logistics so vast that even the Germans couldn't comprehend it. The Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's last gamble, came that winter. The Battle of the Bulge. Desperate, brutal, cold. German tanks struck through the snow in one final attempt to split the Allied lines. But America didn't break. In places like Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, American troops held firm. When asked to surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent one word in reply. Nuts. That defiance summed up the entire spirit of America's war. Within weeks, the counterattack began. American bombers filled the skies again, shattering the remnants of Hitler's last offensive. German soldiers, starving and out of fuel, abandoned their tanks and fled on foot. The end was no longer a matter of if, but when. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, Germany's defenses crumbled completely. American engineering units built pontoon bridges faster than the Germans could destroy them. Entire divisions poured into the heart of the Reich. The once proud cities of Hitler's empire, Cologne, Nuremberg, Munich, were now broken skeletons, surrounded by fire and silence. Everywhere the Americans advanced, they found the same thing, devastation and despair. Civilians who had once cheered Hitler now hid in cellars, trembling as the echoes of their leader's madness faded into dust. German soldiers, no longer fanatical, surrendered in groups. Many were just boys. And then came the most haunting discoveries, the concentration camps. American soldiers, hardened by years of battle, were struck silent as they entered Buchenwald, Dachau, and countless others. What they saw there, the emaciated survivors, the piles of bodies, the smell of death, revealed the true face of Hitler's empire. It was not the empire of order and power he had promised. It was an empire of horror. In those moments, every American soldier understood why this war had to be fought, and why it had to end here, in the ruins of the Reich. By April 1945, Allied forces surrounded Berlin. From the west came the Americans, from the east, the Soviets. The once mighty capital of the Third Reich became a tomb. Inside his bunker, Hitler ranted to ghosts. He ordered armies that no longer existed. He blamed everyone but himself. And as the Red Army closed in, he chose the coward's escape, a bullet and a burning corpse beneath the rubble of his own delusions. When the guns finally fell silent, America's soldiers stood among the ruins, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. They had crossed oceans, endured the impossible, and torn down one of the darkest regimes in human history. But they knew the war was not just won by them, it was won by everyone who built, supplied, and believed. The secret weapon that turned World War II against Germany was not a single invention, not even a bomb. It was the system, the unity of a free people willing to outthink, outwork, and outlast tyranny. And in the ashes of Germany, that truth stood undeniable. Berlin, April, 1945. The once great capital of the Third Reich was no longer a city. It was a wasteland of smoke, blood, and broken concrete. Shells fell every minute. Flames consumed entire streets. The empire that had once conquered half the world now fought for a few ruined blocks. And at the center of it all, deep beneath the city in a bunker of concrete and fear, sat the man who had started it all, Adolf Hitler. The Führer who once commanded millions now ruled over nothing but shadows. His maps showed armies that no longer existed. His orders went unanswered. His generals spoke lies to calm his delusion. He raged at the very world he had tried to dominate, convinced that his people had betrayed him, that fate itself had turned against his will. But the truth was simpler. Hitler's Reich had not been defeated by betrayal. It had been defeated by reality. The reality of American industry. The reality of Allied unity. The reality that tyranny can never outlast creation. Above the bunker, the city fell apart. Soviet artillery pounded the streets day and night. American bombers had already burned Berlin from the sky, now the Red Army was finishing what they had begun. Civilians wandered aimlessly through rubble, clutching photographs of sons who would never return. Children scavenged for food in bombed-out train stations. The empire of steel and glory had dissolved into starvation and ruin. Hitler refused to see it. He spent his final days in a fog of denial, writing decrees for phantom armies, demanding counterattacks from divisions that existed only in his imagination. He ranted that the German people had failed him. That they deserved annihilation for not being worthy of his vision. It was no longer leadership, it was madness laid bare. As the Red Army closed in, Hitler's most loyal followers began to flee or die. Some tried to escape west, hoping to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. Others took their own lives, unwilling to face the end. Goebbels, his propaganda minister, stayed to the bitter end, still believing in the myth. His final broadcast declared that the Führer would never surrender, that his spirit would live on in Germany. But by then, there was no Germany left to hear him. On April 30, 1945, inside the bunker, Hitler made his final choice. As Soviet shells shook the ground above, he sat with his new wife, Eva Braun, said a few last words to his staff, and retreated to his private chamber. A gunshot echoed through the hallway. The tyrant who had set the world on fire was dead, by his own hand. His body was burned in the garden above, as ordered, while Soviet troops fought just streets away. Within hours, the swastika that had flown over Berlin was torn down. And with that, the Reich was no more. But the end of Hitler was not the end of the story. The world he tried to enslave now faced the task of rebuilding itself. In the West, American soldiers helped feed the starving, heal the wounded, and stabilize the chaos. In the East, Soviet forces occupied what was left of Germany. The map of Europe was redrawn, and the world entered a new age, divided, uncertain, yet free from the nightmare that had consumed it. And though Hitler had believed himself immortal, history rendered its verdict swiftly. He had built his empire on hatred, fear, and lies, and such things cannot endure. The great irony was that everything he despised, democracy, industry, cooperation, had been the forces that destroyed him. The same factories he mocked, the same workers he considered inferior, the same soft democracies he dismissed, they became the architects of his downfall. The secret weapon that turned World War II against Germany wasn't just technology or intelligence. It was humanity itself, disciplined, determined, and united against darkness. As Berlin fell silent, and the last flames of the Reich died out, the world exhaled. The monster was gone. But the scars, on nations, on hearts, on history, would remain for generations. Yet even in the ashes, there was hope. Because the victory over tyranny had proven something eternal. That no matter how powerful evil becomes, the human spirit, when awakened, will always rise higher. The war was over. Berlin lay in ruins. The flags of the Allies fluttered where once the swastika ruled. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of that conflict, the most devastating in human history, would shape the world forever. For out of the ashes of the Second World War rose something extraordinary. Not just peace, but a new kind of power. And at the heart of it stood America. In 1939, the United States was still recovering from the Great Depression, weary, inward-looking, uncertain of its place in the world. By 1945, it had become the most powerful nation on Earth. Its cities were untouched by war. Its industries were booming. Its scientists had unlocked secrets that would define the next century. And its ideals, freedom, innovation, unity, had proven stronger than the iron fist of tyranny. That transformation was no accident. It was the result of the same force that had turned the tide of war, the invisible weapon that Hitler never understood, the power of creation. While the Axis sought domination through destruction, America built its strength through production, intelligence, and collaboration. Its armies fought, yes, but its people created. They created machines, alliances, and hope. Factories that once built bombers turned to making cars again. Scientists who developed radar and code breaking went on to pioneer computers, medicine, and space exploration. The infrastructure of war became the architecture of peace. Across Europe, America poured billions into rebuilding what had been destroyed. The Marshall Plan became the most ambitious act of reconstruction in history, not an occupation, but a resurrection. It rebuilt Germany, fed the starving, revived industry, and laid the foundation for a united Western Europe. It was a strategy born not of vengeance, but of vision. Where Hitler had tried to enslave the continent, America sought to rebuild it. And that was the true secret weapon, not bombs, not tanks, not codes, but the will to rebuild after destruction. The soldiers who had crossed oceans now came home as heroes, changed forever, yet carrying with them the lessons of sacrifice and unity. The world entered a new era, the atomic age, the Cold War, the dawn of modern democracy and technology. Every skyscraper that rose, every invention that reshaped daily life, carried within it the same spirit that had once fueled the war effort, the belief that anything could be achieved when free people stand together. The story of America's rise in World War II is not just a tale of military victory. It is a story of human endurance, how ingenuity defeated ideology, how factories defeated fanaticism, and how light returned to a world consumed by darkness. Adolf Hitler believed fear was power. He believed that terror could bend the will of nations. But history proved him wrong. True power does not come from domination, it comes from creation. It comes from minds that build, from hands that work, from people who refuse to give in. That was the real secret weapon that turned World War II against Germany, and it's the same force that still shapes our world today. Because every time humanity faces tyranny, the same question is asked. Can we rise again? And the answer, written in the smoke of war and the steel of peace, is always yes. So as we look back at the greatest of struggles, remember this. The power that won the war was never about destruction. It was about what came after, the rebuilding, the reimagining, the refusal to stay broken. That is the legacy of victory. That is the triumph of creation over chaos. And that is what changed history forever. Gold military medal if you found this story powerful. If you believe history still has lessons to teach us, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. So that more people can remember how courage, unity, and creation saved the world from darkness. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember, and what we choose to become.